necessarily tribal or regional.
But I have said that.
All right, welcome back. If you are just joining us, this is Daybreak on Trust Television. Now, let's take a look at some of the stories that made headways on our dailies this morning. We'll begin with the Daily Trust newspaper. Tributes are gushing in. The lead story there states Bashir Tofa, 1947 to 2022. Writer, politician, activist laid to rest in Kano. Buhari governors, ACF, NEF, others pay tributes. That story, you're going to find the details, of the life and times of Bashir Tofa on page 5 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Now on page 20, you'd see judiciary cases, personalities to look out for this year. Other stories, crisis rocks Kebbi APC as factional leadership emerges. Price of crude oil hits $78.34 ahead of OPEC meeting. And you'd also see on page 4, Wison for a bandit kingpin, Turji released 52 captives. PDP, APC, Bika over El-Rufai's achievements. You'd also find controversy trails selection of new Olubadan. Husband hires friend for 10,000 to kill pregnant wife in Ogun. That's quite tragic. I actually thought we've moved past these kind of very, very sad stories. Well, we found the details of that story on page 27 on the Daily Trust newspaper. These are some of the lead stories you could find.
All right, now let's take a look at the Blueprint newspaper this morning. Now, the lead story there talks about 2 months to his demise. Tofa tells youth, we have almost exhausted our sojourn on earth. Well, that's something that I'm sure will be ringing in the minds of many of those youths. You also have other stories there that talks about Nigeria to retrieve over 1,500 stolen artifacts in 2022. That's according to the DG, NCMM, and also you would have developing livestock value chain to save Nigeria 30 billion naira yearly. That's according to the RMRDC. Other stories there below the nameplate. APC convention, why February is sacrosanct. That's PGF boss. At the very bottom of the pictorial, the pictorial shows you the burial of Bashir Tofa, and then below that you'd see lawyer to Makinde, be cautious on choice of next Olubadan, warn on Ibadan chieftaincy customary laws, and that's on page 5 of the Blueprint newspaper. At the bottom, rising inflation frustrating Nigeria's economic recovery. That's World Bank, I beg your pardon. Allow us access forex from autonomous window. APCON. Jailbreakers, over 3,000 escapees still on the run. That's according to Nigeria Correctional Service. The next one there says, have no hand in Ilana Omodua's threat over Ekiti or Shumpols. That's according to Ibohu. Well, these are the lead stories on the Blueprint newspaper.
Okay, let's take a look at other stories on our dailies this morning. On This Day newspaper, no controversy on who becomes next Olubadan, says Ibadan High Chiefs. The riders declare new king will be chosen based on tradition. Oyo, ex-AG advises Makinde against appointment of new Oba. You'd also see Jonathan Sanwo-Olu Anyim mourn late monarch. Other stories, Buhari Tinubu facilitate with Bolaji Akinyemi at 80. You'd also see Buhari Tofa, true and irreplaceable nationalist. Ex-presidential candidate buried in between parents' graves. Atiku, Ganduje, Buni also pouring in their tributes. Federal government commences collection of income tax on bonds, short-term securities from today. Stockbrokers express divergent view over new policy. And on page 5 on this day newspaper, you'd see oil prices bullish as 2022 market outlook remains positive. These are some of the lead stories on this day newspaper.
All right, now let's take a look at the Punch newspaper. On the Punch, you'd see the lead story, New Year celebrations. Experts project high infection rate as Nigerians shun protocols at fun spots. Yes, we saw that from the pictures we saw coming from some of the parks, and gardens, and even the beach in Lagos, the Oniro beach yesterday. I saw the crowd there was really crazy and massive. So it's expected if we see a spike in the cases of COVID-19. The writer talks about uncontrolled crowds at beaches, others to feel community transmission, expert warns. Recovery rate drops by 73.2%, and CDC distributes 400,000 COVID-19 testing kits. You'll also see the picture there showing you Lagos train service will begin this year. That's according to Sanwo-Olu. I believe that's coming from his visit to the rail station on a, I guess, supervisory visit. And also you'd see below that, police go after revealers behind attack on Temi in Rivers community. You'd also find APC tackles Shehu Sani over government beat, calls ex-senator idol blogger. Well, you also see Lasma thugs, brutalized driver impounds bus agency, ignores driver's petition. And then at the very bottom, Sanwo-Olu, Wike, others mourn Olubadan, hail monarch for contributions. Men exchange blows, arrested as hired killer fails to eliminate pregnant ex-wife. 8 dead, 17 injured in Ogun. Akwa Ibom crashes. FRC blames speeding and others. Then at the very top there, you'd see also SEC and the CBN, others to lift financial sector with fresh 1.54 trillion naira investment. Customs, immigration, 13 others failed to remit 127 billion naira audit report. Nigeria's debt vulnerable, costly alerts World Bank. Sustained bombings force terrorists to surrender, ACF tells military. And so these are the stories on the front page of the Punch newspaper today.
Okay, on The Guardian this morning, the lead story there, legal hurdle clouds Olubadan succession. The writers, Lekan Balogun not qualified to be Olubadan. Ex-Oyo AG writes, Ladoja absent as Ibadan chiefs hold meeting at Balogun's house. It also see elevation of high chiefs to Obas doesn't alter Ibadan's succession process, says Olubadan in council. And to other stories, labor unions strategize ahead of proposed fuel subsidy removal. And the Guardian MD editor-in-chief loses dad. On page 7 on the Guardian, IPOB bans Nigerian anthem in Southeast schools, use of cows at ceremonies. That's quite an imposure. You'll find the details of that story on page 7 on the Guardian newspaper. To other stories, tension in Imo as Uzodinma uncovers alleged sponsors of insecurity. Tributes pour in as Tofa dies at 74. These are some of the stories on the Guardian this morning.
All right, finally on the Punch, the Nation rather. On the Nation newspaper, the first story there, name prosecute terror sponsors, that's according to Ndume, telling the federal government. Buhari governors, ACF, others mourn Tofa. That's on page 29. The story about Tofa is literally on all these newspapers today, and we'll be looking at his life and time here as well. Lagos, red, blue rail line project still on course. DBN seeks stakeholders not to raise 100 billion naira bond. And then you see also OPEC worried over threat to release 70 million barrels from reserves. And then the lead story says Olubadan, Ibadan chiefs disagree over succession. And then the riders there, Ladoja's lawyer says Balogun not qualified, kingmakers to follow traditional guidelines. Then ban, Twitter meets conditions. Buhari awaits panel's report. So these are the stories on the front pages of our newspapers this morning. And to get perspectives, we have Sunday Michael, Deputy Business Editor, Daily Trust newspaper. Good morning.
Good morning.
And welcome to Daybreak.
Good morning and Happy New Year.
You're welcome. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
All right. Well, let's have a look at some of the stories here that we, saw. There's one that I saw on The Guardian that sounds hilarious, actually, about IPOB banning Nigerian anthem in the Southeast schools and the use of cows at ceremonies and all of that.
That's quite absurd.
Let's get your thoughts around this story.
Now that you're mentioning it, that means people like Obi Kubana would have been in jail by with the numbers of cows we saw. I think these are all attempts to continue to delineate themselves from the structure called Nigeria. So if you ban cows, you are basically just saying, okay, we will not patronize things that come from the other parts of the world because we know cows are largely reared from the north, all right? But the way the country is structured, you are the ones who have most of the ceremonies that desire this thing. So I wonder what would be the alternative for cows. Maybe a million chicken, maybe.
Or maybe goats.
Goats.
In any case, the goats themselves come from.
You begin to then dimension how many goats in a cow and how many goats you then have to do to get what a cow can do in one fell swoop. And the whole thing about slaughtering a cow for ceremony is also a status thing. It's a symbol thing about how people who are rich would like to make their events or distinguish their events from what most of us would naturally do. Well, they've always come up with things like this, but I don't see how this is sustainable because even at Nnamdi Kanu's father's burial, cows were killed. So.
At some point we had some peace and quiet, and then now suddenly they're issuing,
it became a bit quiet after a number of interventions, both frontally by the military and back channels intervention. We deserve a moment of quiet, really. It became heightened with the elections around that region, and after the elections, we've had a bit of quiet. I hope that some way we sustain whatever we have done in the last couple of months to continue to see that ultimately that we have a united Nigeria, and whatever the grievances of these various units of the country are, somehow we find a way to come to the table and resolve it.
All right. Another interesting story, actually, on our front pages is a story about the Olubadan succession. That's already creating some kind of controversy and tension and all of that. The man in question is barely been laid to rest, just yesterday.
So
and
much battle.
already we are seeing this,
Back and forth,
battle, if you like, you may call it Game of Thrones, right?
Indeed.
So, is this expected?
Yes, it is. If you have taken your time to follow the story of succession everywhere in this country, and maybe if you like around the world, it has always been like this. The moment somebody is pronounced dead, as far as they are concerned, that chapter is closed. The whole question of whether he's buried, he needs to be mourned, are just a different thing altogether. The scheming, even where the succession is determined by the immediate family, even where, in fact, the successor is practically known, it doesn't completely take away people who attempt to scheme, because for them, it's a lifetime, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to ascend this throne and even change the dynamics of their family story forever. Not to talk of places like this where the ascension to the throne is not exactly about a family thing. It's about people who had made it into a council, and then it can fall on one of those council members, as against other places where the immediate family of the deceased takes over, or where there are ruling houses where it is predetermined that after this ruling house, it then goes to the next. In fact, even where there are ruling houses, the controversies are still there, because when it comes to a ruling house, unlike before where they said the most senior person ascends, now it becomes what is our best foot forward. Because some people want to remain in the throne for a long time. So sometimes maybe the most senior person, as we had with this, the late Olubadan, is already in his late 80s, and you bring them in, there is only so long he can live. So sometimes they move away from all of those persons and go and get a very young, vibrant young person who they think his time on the throne would last so long as to rub off on every member of the family. So all of these dynamics have a way of putting tension on the people who make the pronouncement. So you get this skimming left, right. I mean, we saw it with the Emir of Kano's, the one before this, when Sanusi was to be announced. You know, there were quite a number of very fitting contenders at the time, and everybody had all kinds of puzzle around it until Sanusi, late Emir Sanusi, let me not ignite it, right? I mean, sorry, former Emir Sanusi was chosen. So you get this kind of schemes. In this case, it has been complicated by an existing court case, you know, a court pronouncement, you know, that needs to determine the status of who can ascend to the throne or who is not qualified. And what the former Attorney General is saying is that until a court pronouncement is made or they dispose of that case, then it will be difficult to stick to what used to be the tradition.
But, you know, I'm looking at, you know, the role that development, politics, democracy, you know, has played in kind of changing the way traditional offices, you know, are held. In the past, you hardly would hear all these litigations, you know, and all of that. That's talking about back then, in centuries ago, maybe decades ago, and they run their, you know, their kingdoms, you know, effectively, without, you know, such things. Highest, maybe you would have frictions, and then there will be battle, and then there will be fights, and all that. But now you have governors, you have, you know, political office holders, you know, meddling in the whole affairs and all of that. Is that really good?
Well, it depends on what you define as good. Society has evolved quite rapidly to the extent where people have become uncomfortable with what used to be. And today, with the benefit of the media, every little controversy is there on the front burner, so it becomes easy to tell. We cannot exactly say that there were no controversy those days, but maybe they are not as blown today, I mean, those days as they are today. And two, you now have people who have become extremely rich and successful outside the throne, whose money, you know, can give them the ability to, they become demigods unto themselves because they have the finances to make things happen. You also have the government, as bequeathed to us by the colonialists, that is not an extraction of the ruling house. You know, that also were contending for authority and power. In the case of Ibadan, you remember the late governor telling people that I have the constituted authority in this time. In other words, there is no other power besides me. And they made it such that what used to be our own traditional system of government became subservient to the democratic system of government. The idea is not exactly wrong. It was just that one came up through a system not many of us know how it came about or can explain why somebody is born and is entitled to be a king, why, whether or not is better educated than all of us, or, you know, I suppose. And so what the democratic system of government afforded us was the fact that we all can choose who leads us through an open and transparent system, and that any one of us who, with the right, with the prerequisites, can aspire, you know, to become a leader, to vote and to be voted for. It kind of democratized leadership. But the idea was, do we then throw away what we inherited, or how do we carry these institutions alongside what we have now come to accept as a more democratic way of choosing leaders? And so that friction, that that looking for that fine balance about preserving what we had always known as a monarchy or as kingship, and then having a democratic work side by side and finding relevance for the two of them is what has brought us to this level. So a governor comes in, if the king is becoming overbearing, he dethrones him and bring in somebody else. So all of
Too
those
much
things
drama.
distorted how these flows has happened. And then within those families, somebody who probably his turn will be in another century now has so much money and can upturn the Council of Chiefs and get them to make decisions that will favor him and set aside several other families who will get. All of those kind of politics in time past have completely altered what used to be a smooth flow, and today we have all this kind of controversy.
All right, now let's take a look at, other stories. Tributes, are pouring in to someone who many would describe as a true nationalist. Many say he was the voice of the North, Bashir Tofa. Could you just comment on who Bashir Tofa really was?
I wish I had the words to better describe him than the papers have already done. Some describe him as a true statesman, a true gentleman. And that is what he has been. If you cast your mind back to all the time that we have known him, you will rarely associate him with any kind of controversy. The type that we get from some elder statesmen today that seem to tear the country apart, or divide the country into different units. I am standing for this whole. I'm a statesman, but I am for my people first.
Ethnic jingo.
The ethnic jingo is basically, So he isn't one you want to associate with those kind of perception. He has not bred that kind of brand. At any rate, you will recall that he contested for the presidency of this country twice. In fact, somebody wrote a fine line of how death reminds us of our mortality when he said, this is Bashir Tofa's grave, the man who once described himself as the answer. We were young at the time. I remember very well the jingles of 93. They rest in my head, between Abiola but it was very nice, SDP and PDP at the time. You can practically remember the wordings of those jingles, and they've lived with us all these years. And you know what's interesting about this phenomenon was the fact that he contested for the presidency around 43.
Wow.
So you can imagine why he has been in our memories for so long. And despite, losing out of that under very controversial, the whole annulment of 2020, he has remained a calm individual, only coming to the scene to intervene when there is a crisis and taking the backseat, like when Emir Sanusi was disposed. And of course, he had his own following. The people in Kano were not sure how the followers were going to react to that news and whether it will lead to the breakdown of law and all that. They were the kind of people who used back channels to calm nerves, and enable the government move on. At some point, they said he had a following in Kano that was described as the major opposition party, and he had to dispel all of those kind of rumors with media interviews. They say, I am nobody's enemy. I mean, at this age, I can't even begin to cut enemy for anybody. I am more closer to my grave than wanting to start building enmity. Our interest is for a peaceful and progressive society. So he was that kind of person. I'm sure the various leaders that we have had over time have had to reach him privately to seek for some kind of counsel on how to go about. You would not see him uttering, even in his comments about this government, he chose his words wisely. He talked about how the advisors of the president are not the best for this country and how they had not really helped him see certain things in the light of which they are, rather than just come out to say, no, you are incompetent, you are lame, you are not, So he was such a fine gentleman, one whom you would want those who have put on the toga of elder statesmen by the virtue of their age to look up to and try to emulate, his persona in a way that doesn't bring hits, but rather unites this country in their addresses.
All right. Now, very interesting. We are also having some other interesting stories. We'll revisit the issue of Tofa, his life and time, later on the program. We'll be having, we're anticipating a guest that will be talking about that, joining us virtually, talking about Engineer Sani Yabagi, who himself was also a chieftain of the same party as late Bashir Tufa. Now, this story about naming, persecuting terror sponsors and Dume is blowing hot again. We, watched from an interview he granted, talking about how he was accused of being a sponsor of, Boko Haram, and how that dented his image. And now he's also urging, the federal government to, name the sponsors. I mean, it feels like we've been having this conversation forever, and it doesn't look like the naming and the shaming is ever going to happen.
This is one aspect of this fight against terrorists insurgency that we have completely mismanaged. If you recall, between 2010 and today, 12 years later, what we call name and shame is basically to loop political enemies into that basket of sponsors of terrorists. Once you don't like anybody's face, you just simply say they are the ones sponsoring. We played so much with it that it lost the credibility that it needed. I mean, when the current government was in the opposition, they said, no, it's the government that is sponsoring terrorists against our people because they want to reduce our numbers. So they made it look like an election thing. They made it, it deserved more seriousness than merely just looping anybody into that name and shame thing. If a government in a state is not comfortable with its own political enemies or people in the opposition party, it names them as the sponsors of terror. We are seeing that not just in the Southeast, even in places like Imo, like in Rivers. If you speak against the government, then you are the one sponsoring terror at home against that government and all of that. So we've used it so cheaply that it has lost relevance. The whole concept of naming terrors are actually far more scientific than they are political. If you say somebody is a sponsor, then you must be able to show how. The onus of proof, the burden of proof, rests with you, the accuser, because for you to come out to make those pronouncements, you would have been able to show, with the help of the security agency, and by the way, they have the capacity if they choose to work, to show how this person has enabled funding.
So is it that we do not have enough evidence to actually name this sponsors?
I mean, are we even looking for the evidence? Are we? We have made a number of arrests. Today, the government is proud to tell you over 10,000 people have surrendered. But is it just enough to come out and surrender? Are they being debriefed? These people lived a life several years in the jungle, and they had a system that supported that lifestyle. How they fed, how they lived, how they got arms, how they kidnapped people, how they took ransom, how they escaped a military invasion, how they got information about our people, how they lay siege on the army. Are we debriefing them? What are the lessons, for the current strategy? What do we learn? Is it possible? I mean, you move tens of millions of naira to people in the bush and we can't explain where all that money went? Or that our securities could not put any kind of chips on this funding to track. And
how it is spent.
To track the movement of the fund, or even mark this currency to track how they went. Then you see an ammunition comes in. Every ammunition has a serial number. Have we, after arresting these guys and picking up this ammunition, have we tried to do an audit? Get back to the manufacturers and say, you manufacture ABC and XYZ around so time. Who did you sell to? And then we track to those people. After using this for a year or two, did you sell this also? I mean, yesterday we saw reports that over 173,000 arms, guns were missing in the police armory. My goodness. 173,000 guns. We can't even count the magazines. I mean, do you understand this kind of?
Some would actually say, is naming them more of a priority than actually shutting down?
If we even want to name them, we should do it the right way. At any rate, it's not just about naming them. It's not enough to say you're a criminal and they let you continue to roam the street. It's about looking for this hard evidence so that you can nail these people and put them behind bars forever. It's not just about naming them. And it is because the whole system is messed up. It makes it look like we are talking about rocket science. It's not rocket science. One of those days, I was in a vehicle going to Benue, and I joined a private vehicle driven by a policeman, by another policeman, and They engaged in a long conversation. I wasn't part of it. I was just listening shortly after one of the elections. And one of them was talking about one of his boys that he had to lock in a guard room before traveling because the guy sold the service pistol. And just came back and said people attacked him. And gave himself, he actually shot himself with one of the bullets and to show how he escaped.
Is that because of poverty or what?
Well, I don't know how to explain that. And he sold that pistol for 250,000 after his own boss. I mean, it takes a criminal to catch a criminal. Anyway, said after interrogating him, he said the wife was in the hospital. She needed to give birth. She needed to go through operation. He has asked everybody. Nobody was willing to borrow him money. And so there was somebody that has told him, help me get a gun, that the person is not a criminal. He's trying to protect himself. He lives in an area that is terrorized by criminals. So the only way to get a gun was to get a service pistol. And I said, but these things are registered. They went to take a file and one of the numbers of the gun, they cleaned one of the numbers so that it doesn't correspond with what you have.
My goodness.
I was hearing that live. I mean, if that guy, junior officer at that level could do that, you can imagine what even the senior officers do. So how do we even tell? Because the testimonies we often see are sort of teleguided. So how every time they come out and parade criminals and parade 3 guns, how are we able to tell that it was actually just 3 guns they got? Who is able to determine that they didn't get 6 and displayed 3 and sold 3 back to the same system using the back channel? So there's so much questions that need to be asked. These days you go into a crime scene, they litter it up because they don't even want to create the room for you to pick sensitive things that you can then analyze, to find out what really happened. So there's so much question to be asked. Getting these sponsors is not exactly anything difficult if our security wants to work, and if they think they don't have the tool, merely partnering with Interpol or partnering with other agencies in the world can help us do some of these things.
And how important is this naming itself, to the fight against the terrorism and insurgency?
Well, to know the sponsor of a thing is to cut life, it's to cut blood supply. I will give you a simple example. During the Civil War, when we had a finance minister, Awolowo was the finance minister of Nigeria, we needed to develop a fiscal strategy to also win the war, because the wars are not just about guns and the soldiers. There are so much strategy around it. And he basically advised the government to say, hey, you cannot be fighting a people and be feeding them, even though that is the deadly strategy today in the world. But basically cutting away food, water supply and drugs cost more damage to the East than merely shooting people down. Because for you to, as simple as a gun looks, for you to be able to lift it, you must have had some food, right?
Really ask quite a lot.
So that in itself was a strategy. So that was why I was asking questions about how do these people feed? How do they survive? How do they get the fuel that moves those hundreds of bikes with which they carry out those hundreds of kidnaps and coordinate those fantastic attacks into the bush?
Fantastic indeed.
Do they have filling stations?
Do you get that?
How do they move?
Look at the guys who had come out of the bush after several months or several years to say they are handing over. You don't see, can you imagine you being outside in a developed place like Abuja, just staying outside unprotected with some part of your skin open by 7 p.m. You'll be beaten to hell with mosquitoes. And these guys live in the bush and they come out and they're okay. So how do they survive? These are basic questions that if we interrogate with all of the people who said they are handing over, we'll begin to put 2 and 2 together and begin to understand this entire network. So it's not just about guns and tanks and helicopters and everything. It's about the channels of supply. Can we cut them off? These things succeeded in places like Somalia and the rest, where when they started running their disarmament program, they were getting back AK-47 with just a loaf of bread. What's the use of an AK-47 to you if you are hungry and you'll drop dead in the next minute?
Well, thank you so much for this perspectives on this story. It's very, very interesting there. Now, we will take a quick break, and then when we come back, we will be continuing our discussion on the program. Please stay with us.
The board and management of Media Trust Limited invites the general public to its annual Daily Trust Dialogue, themed 2023, The Politics, Economy and Insecurity. Date, 20th January 2022. Location, NAF Conference Center and Suites, Abuja. Time, 10 a.m. prompt. Chairman of the occasion, former head of state General Abdulsalami Abubakar, GCFR. Guest speaker, Governor of Kaduna State Malam Nasir Ahmed El-Rufai. Guest speaker, Governor of Ebonyi State Engineer David Umahi. Guest speaker, former Chairman Federal Inland Revenue Service Mrs. Ifueko Omoigui Okauru. Moderator, Executive Director, Daria Media Nigeria Limited, Kadariya Ahmed. The event will be transmitted live on Trust TV, and all participants must observe COVID-19 protocols and wear their face masks.
Get latest updates on current topical issues and breaking news by downloading the Trust TV mobile app on your Android devices. Go online, click Google Play Store, search Trust TV, install the app, and get doses of unfiltered information on happenings all over the world in your pocket. Trust TV, documenting the Nigerian story.
All right, welcome back. If you are just joining us, this is Daybreak on Trust Television, and right here we're taking a look at the stories that made headways on our dailies this morning, and we have Deputy Business Editor, Daily Trust, Sunday Michael, giving us perspectives on the stories that made headways on the papers this morning.
On the Nation newspaper, we have some very interesting stories there. One of them about Twitter ban. We are hearing that Twitter has met the conditions, required, by the federal government. So it appears that it will soon have a comeback, of Twitter for many social media users in Nigeria. Maybe we should be excited.
Well, maybe, yes, because for people who are ardent followers of Twitter, they found a way to continue to remain on the app. What is painful is that even the visibility that the government itself enjoyed from Twitter, it lost by taking that drastic action. It is still left to be seen whether or not this whole decision was a gain or a loss for Nigeria. Especially given that this government was a massive beneficiary of the social media in pushing out its messages and campaigns and all of that. And there's something critical to the whole community of Nigerians on Twitter. Is the age bracket that is critical. You cannot be talking to anybody 40 and below today using the traditional medium. They are not there. They are not, so they're basically not listening to you. Twitter, among other social media outlets, provided that kind of... you would not like the way they talk. They are fierce. They are... I mean, the things they won't say to you physically, they can afford to tell you over the social media. But it's the reality of the people you have to lead. There is no running away from it. Other systems have even people who are even more fierce, who are even more educated. They found a way to live with it. So you cannot choose how your followers will react to you. If you don't want all those kind of confrontation, stay away. Right. And by so doing, you cannot say because they have chosen those kind of foul language, you would also resort to using those kind of languages. So, one, we are a sovereign country, but if you want a service and there is a service condition attached to you, you are also willing to either meet the service condition or not want it at all. Right. In our own case, I think we took an affront to Twitter, restricting the account of our own president, or deleting tweets that violated his own community service. So it's a balance between these are our rules, and these ones are saying this is our country. So if you have to operate here, you must keep to this one. This guy is saying if you have to use our app, then you must also. So I think it is finding that fine balance. It also, there is a conversation, is not just a Nigerian thing. It's something that is happening around the world over what amount of freedom or restriction should we have with this kind of, and what is a no-go area? I mean, with regards to how the service providers also treat a sovereign government. So I think it's a good opportunity to have had this conversation. I know one of the benefits was asking them to open an office in Nigeria. I hope that was also, and then the whole thing about paying taxes is not just to Twitter. It's a conversation, in fact, that actually predates this government. I remember the former Minister of Finance, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, down to the early days of Kemi Adeosun, talking about how there are virtual services that are making billions in this country, but in a way are not paying back. So I think to that extent, it's a win-win for for both parties. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you know, before the Twitter ban, Twitter was quite an explosive platform for Nigerians. So if eventually we get to see a comeback, do you think people will still have that feel of what Twitter used to be like?
They will, because Twitter gives a different kind of messaging platform that none of the existing social media platform has been able to replicate. Short, feisty, actionable points. You know, they just drop them within 144 words, and it is. I mean, for people who still follow using VPNs, there's a whole lot of conversations and trends happening over that. But because there had been a whole lot of talk around how even safe the VPNs are with regards to making your information available to anonymous VPN providers that you do not know who could hack into your system and all, it has sort of reduced people's predisposition to the whole idea of, you know, the VPN thing is like hacking into an open Wi-Fi. You don't know who is looking, you don't know who is tapping your information and all. So if it becomes available again and it is enabled such that you don't even need all of these reconnections, you know, to get it will surely pick up again, because the followership and the steam that emanates from Twitter, it's about what we make of it. It's not just about the app, you know, as an entity. It's because it is convenient for most people to jump on it, drop a lot of information, and then get immediate engagement, because sometimes it is not even about the tweet, it's about the reaction to the tweets, you know, that are even far more interesting than the tweet. You recall, in fact, even in one of our stories we reviewed this morning, where the government of a state describing an opposition person as an idle blogger. But he's got so much following on Twitter, even more than the state government. His following on Twitter is bigger than the state government following on Twitter. You know, but they call him an idle blogger. Whether or not that is true is a different, but he has a following that outweighs Kaduna. It's not just about the people in Kaduna. He's that big on the social media.
Okay.
That is what
all right, briefly, in 1 minute, I would like you to comment on the jailbreaks that we experienced last year. We are hearing that 3,000 escapees are still at large, and this is coming from the NCS itself. So are we ever going to get those escapees back?
It's painful, it's irritating, it's shameful. You know, it ties back to the whole comments around naming and shaming. It is you and I, as enlightened as we are, and as exposed as we are, don't even know any of the 3,000 they are looking for. Their names are not on any newspaper, they are not on any media website. You cannot, so we probably all had gone past these so-called wanted people 100 times over. We don't even know who they are. What it simply speaks to is the fact that these people don't also have biodatas about these persons. So what they do in other places, if somebody is a sensitive, wanted person, if you go to the airport, you see their pictures everywhere. If you go to the rail stations, you see their pictures everywhere. If you go to public places like post office, they have their posters everywhere, billboards. So we have not even seen these people come up with this data. And you would have shared security information about them so that if they attempt to attempt anything that they use their thumbprint, it should trigger an alarm that this person is a wanted person. If you attempt to use a bank statement or do a transfer because it is tied to a BVN that is tied to a person who is wanted, it should trigger. That is why we have all of this multi-layer information about duplicating our data everywhere, but when you really need them to track people, it doesn't exist.
Quite sad.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show this morning and sharing your perspectives with us. We've been speaking with the Deputy Business Editor, Daily Trust, Sunday Michael, giving us her perspectives on the stories that made the headlines this morning. Now, we will take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll be having other discussions on the program. Thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure.